Blood trickled down Clara Faulkner's palm where her nails had dug into soft flesh, the only outward sign of the terror that gripped her as the stagecoach rattled along the dusty trail toward Whispering Pines, Wyoming Territory, 1875, a place she'd never been, but was now expected to call home. The journey from Boston had been long, each mile carrying her further from the life she knew and closer to the one she feared. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a schoolteacher with modest prospects. Now she was a mail-order bride, traveling to marry a man she knew only through a handful of letters and a faded daguerreotype, Charles Quinn, cattle rancher, 32 years old, widower. The facts swirled in her mind like autumn leaves caught in a gale. What kind of man sought a bride through newspaper advertisements? What kind of desperation drove him to such measures? The same kind that drove her, she supposed, the need to escape crushing debt after her father's death, to avoid the poorhouse, to survive. "Almost there, miss," the driver called down. "Whispering Pines just beyond that ridge." Clara straightened her spine and adjusted her bonnet, the only item of clothing she owned that hadn't seen better days. The dress she wore, a faded blue cotton, had been mended 3 times over. She'd sold nearly everything of value to pay for her passage west. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear that coiled in her stomach like a rattlesnake. The stagecoach crested the hill, and Clara caught her first glimpse of the settlement below a cluster of wooden buildings straddling the main street, surrounding businesses, a white church steeple rising above the rest. It was smaller than she'd imagined, more remote. As they rattled down the slope toward town, she pressed a handkerchief to her lips. Stories of mail-order brides meeting cruel fates at the hands of deceptive husbands had haunted her dreams for weeks. Some found themselves little more than servants, others faced unspeakable brutality. Would Charles Quinn be the gentleman his letters suggested, or would his true nature emerge once the marriage was sealed? The coach rolled to a stop before the town's only hotel, a 2-story clapboard building with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Clara clutched her small carpet bag, the sum total of her worldly possessions, and waited as the driver opened the door. "Here we are, miss, Whispering Pines." Clara descended the steps carefully, her legs stiff from the journey. The midday sun beat down mercilessly, dust swirling around her ankles as she surveyed the street. Men paused to stare at the newcomer. A young, unaccompanied woman was a rarity in these parts. "Miss Faulkner." She turned at the sound of her name, heart racing. A tall man approached, his stride purposeful, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. His clothes were clean but well-worn, a simple cotton shirt, dark trousers, and a leather vest. No suit and tie as she'd half expected from his letters. "Mr. Quinn?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man stopped a respectful distance away and removed his hat, revealing chestnut hair that curled slightly at his temples. His face was tanned from long days in the sun, with fine lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. His jaw was strong, covered with a neatly trimmed beard. "Yes, madam, Charles Quinn," he confirmed, his voice deeper than she'd imagined. His eyes, a startling green like spring leaves, assessed her with quiet intensity. "You made good time. Wasn't expecting the stage until tomorrow." Clara swallowed hard. The river crossing was easier than anticipated. "We gained a day." He nodded, shifting his weight from one foot to another. She realized he was holding something behind his back. Her pulse quickened. Was it a rope, a whip? Stories of frontier husbands who beat their mail-order brides flashed through her mind. Instead, Charles Quinn brought forward a bouquet of wildflowers, blues, purples, and whites gathered together with a simple twine ribbon. "These grow down by the creek," he said, extending them toward her. "Thought you might like something pretty after such a long journey." Clara stared at the flowers, confusion replacing fear. This gesture didn't align with the cruel taskmaster she'd prepared herself to face. "Welcome home, Miss Faulkner," he added, his voice softening. She accepted the flowers with trembling hands, their delicate scent rising to meet her. "Thank you," she managed, uncertain what to make of this man who didn't match her preconceptions. "I've got the wagon just down the street," Charles said, gesturing. "Unless you'd prefer to rest at the hotel tonight," Clara considered the dilapidated building behind her, then looked back at Charles Quinn. His expression remained open, patient. The decision was genuinely hers. "I would prefer to continue to the ranch," she said finally, "if that's agreeable." Relief visibly washed over him. "Of course, it's about an hour's ride. Your trunk arrive with you." "I have only this," she admitted, indicating her small carpet bag. Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps concern, but he quickly masked it. "Let's get you settled then." He reached for her bag, careful not to touch her hand. "The wagon's this way." As they walked, Clara felt the stares of townspeople following them. A mail-order bride was noteworthy gossip in a place this small. She kept her gaze forward, clutching the wildflowers like a shield. The wagon was simple but well-maintained, hitched to two solid chestnut horses. Charles helped her onto the seat with respectful hands, then settled beside her, leaving as much space between them as the bench allowed. "I hope your journey wasn't too difficult," he said as they pulled away from town. "The roads can be rough this time of year." "It was. Educational," Clara replied carefully. "I've never traveled so far before." Charles nodded, handling the reins with practiced ease. "I reckon Boston's mighty different from Wyoming." "Yes, quite different." She glanced at his profile, studying the man who would soon be her husband. His letters had been articulate, even poetic at times, speaking of the beauty of the land and his hopes for a partnership. But men could lie on paper. "Your letters mentioned you've been in the territory for 8 years. "That's right. Came out after the war. Worked as a ranch hand for the Hartley spread until I could save enough to start my own place." The war. He would have been in his early 20s then. Clara wondered which side he'd fought for, but decided that was a question for another time. "And your ranch, it's prosperous?" she asked instead. A slight smile touched his lips. "Wouldn't call it prosperous yet, but it's growing. Got 60 head of cattle, 4 horses besides these 20 acres of good grazing land, and a cabin that's sturdy if not fancy." He glanced at her. "It's humble compared to what you might be used to in Boston." "I lived simply in Boston as well, Mr. Quinn. My father was a professor, not a wealthy man." The road wound through rolling hills covered with sagebrush and wildflowers similar to those in her bouquet. In the distance, mountains rose against the sky, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer heat. "It's beautiful here," Clara said softly, surprising herself with the admission. "Gets in your blood," Charles agreed. "Different kind of beauty than back east, wilder, more honest somehow." They rode in silence for a time, the rhythmic creaking of the wagon and the steady clop of hooves the only sounds. Clara found herself relaxing incrementally, the immediate fear of brutality receding. Charles Quinn seemed decent if reserved. "Miss Faulkner," he said eventually, his voice careful. "I want you to know something before we reach the ranch." Her hands tightened on the flowers. Here it came, the revelation, the true character emerging. "I don't expect. That is our arrangement." He cleared his throat. "What I mean to say is there's a spare room for you. Until you decide if you want to proceed with the marriage." Clara turned to look at him fully, astonished. "You're not expecting us to marry immediately?" "No, madam. I figure you should have time to know your own mind, see the place, see if you can abide living out here, see if you can abide me." His ears had reddened beneath his hat. Wouldn't be right otherwise. Relief coursed through her so powerfully she nearly swayed on the seat. "That's very considerate, Mr. Quinn. Call me Charles, please." He met her eyes briefly. "And I hope you'll pardon me saying so, but you look like you've been expecting the worst of me." Clara flushed. "I apologize if I've given that impression." "No need for apologies. Can't blame you for being cautious. You've traveled a long way to meet a stranger. Takes courage." He adjusted his hat, squinting at the trail ahead. "Just wanted you to know you're safe here. You've got choices." The rest of the journey passed more comfortably, with Charles pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the area. He spoke of neighbors miles apart, of cattle drives and winter storms, of spring calving and summer markets. His voice grew animated when discussing the land, revealing a deep connection to this wild place. The sun was beginning its descent when they crested a final hill, and the Quinn Ranch came into view. It was indeed modest, a sturdy log cabin with a covered porch, a large barn, several corrals and outbuildings clustered in a protected valley. A creek wound through the property, lined with the cottonwood trees that gave the ranch its name. Cottonwood Creek, Charles said, a hint of pride in his voice. Not much, but it's home. As they approached, a dog came bounding from the porch, a black and white border collie who barked enthusiastically. That's Patch, Charles explained. Best cattle dog in the territory. The dog circled the wagon, tail wagging furiously as they pulled up to the cabin. Beyond the main structures, Clara could see cattle grazing on the hillsides, dark shapes against the golden grass. Charles set the brake and jumped down, coming around to help her descend. His hands were strong but gentle at her waist, lifting her carefully to the ground. "Let me show you inside," he offered, retrieving her bag. The cabin was surprisingly spacious, with a large main room containing a stone fireplace, a solid wooden table with chairs, and a small sitting area with 2 armchairs. A cast iron stove dominated one corner, and shelves lined with books covered much of one wall, more books than Clara had expected to find in a frontier home. "Kitchen's through there," Charles indicated a doorway. "Bedrooms in the back, spare rooms on the left that'll be yours, mine's on the right. There's a washroom out back, and I've rigged a pump in the kitchen so you don't have to haul water from the creek except for laundry." Clara moved slowly through the space, taking in details: the polished wood floors, the simple but clean curtains at the windows, the careful craftsmanship of the furniture. "Did you build this yourself?" she asked. Charles nodded. "Most of it. Had help raising the walls and roof, but the finishing work I did over the winters. It's lovely," she said honestly. "Much nicer than I expected." A small smile touched his lips. "Been working on it extra these past months since your first letter." The thought that he'd prepared so carefully for her arrival touched something deep in Clara's heart. "I'll let you get settled," Charles said, placing her bag just inside the door of the spare room. "I need to see to the animals. Take your time. There's water in the kitchen if you'd like to wash up." When he'd gone, Clara explored her new quarters. The room was small but thoughtfully arranged, with a narrow bed covered in a handmade quilt, a chest of drawers, and a small writing desk beneath the window. Fresh wildflowers sat in a jar on the windowsill, and the walls had been recently whitewashed. Clara unpacked her meager belongings, hanging her 2 spare dresses in the small wardrobe and placing her mother's silver hairbrush on the dresser. The gesture seemed pitiful, a futile attempt to make this strange place her own. When she'd finished, she ventured to the kitchen and found a basin of clean water waiting. She washed her face and hands, then discovered a mirror hanging on the wall. The woman who stared back looked tired, her blue eyes shadowed, her dark blonde hair escaping its pins after the long journey. Clara rebraided her hair and pinched her cheeks for color, suddenly conscious of her appearance in a way she hadn't been during the journey. She smoothed her skirts, wishing she had something nicer to wear. A knock at the door startled her. "Miss Faulkner, dinner's about ready if you're feeling up to it." She hadn't expected him to cook. "Yes, thank you, I'll be right there." When she entered the main room, she found Charles placing a pot of stew on the table, which had been set with simple but clean dishes. A loaf of bread sat on a cutting board, and a jar of preserves stood nearby. "It's nothing fancy," he said, looking almost embarrassed, "but it's filling." "It smells wonderful." Clara took the seat he pulled out for her, acutely aware of their solitude. Back in Boston, propriety would never have allowed her to dine alone with an unmarried man. But here, miles from the nearest neighbor, conventional rules seemed absurd. Charles served her a generous portion, then himself, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice cooking for himself. They ate in silence for a few moments, Clara's hunger overcoming her nervousness. "It's very good," she said finally, breaking the silence. "You're a fine cook, Mr. Charles." He ducked his head slightly. "Had to learn out here a man who can't cook goes hungry. You mentioned in your letters that you lost your wife," Clara said carefully. "I'm very sorry." A shadow crossed his face. "Martha died 5 years ago. Fever took her and our baby." How terrible! Clara's heart ached at the simple statement that contained such loss. It was. Charles tore a piece of bread in half, his movements precise. "We'd only been married a year, came out here together from Missouri, and you've been alone since." He nodded. "The ranch keeps me busy, but a man gets tired of his own company after a while. He looked up, meeting her eyes. I never expected to marry again, then last winter was particularly hard, found myself talking to Patch more than was probably healthy. A small smile touched Clara's lips at the image. When spring came, I rode into town, saw the advertisement for correspondence brides in the newspaper. He shrugged slightly. Your letter stood out. You wrote about books you loved, about teaching children. Seemed like you had a good heart. And you wrote about the beauty of this place, Clara replied softly. About building something lasting. It wasn't just about needing someone to cook and clean. No, it wasn't. His gaze was steady. I want a partner, Miss Faulkner, someone to share the work, yes, but also the joys. Someone to build a life with. The sincerity in his voice touched her. This was not a man looking merely for a convenient arrangement. He was lonely as she was lonely, both adrift in their own ways. I think, she said slowly, if we are to consider a partnership, you should call me Clara. The smile that spread across his face transformed him, lighting his green eyes and revealing a dimple in his right cheek that his beard didn't quite hide. Clara, he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. It suits you. After dinner, they sat on the porch as twilight settled over the valley. The vastness of sky overwhelmed Clara, accustomed as she was to city buildings and narrow views. Here, the horizon stretched endlessly, the sunset painting the clouds in shades of gold and crimson. It's so quiet, she whispered, afraid to disturb the peace. Not really, Charles replied. Just different sounds than you're used to. He was right, she realized. There was the rustle of wind through grass, the distant lowing of cattle, the chirp of crickets beginning their nightly chorus, the soft gurgle of the creek. Not silence, but nature's conversation. Tomorrow I can show you around the property, Charles offered. Introduce you to the horses. If you'd like to learn to ride, that is. I would. Clara found herself genuinely interested. I've never had the opportunity. You'll need it out here. Town's too far to walk, and I can't always be available to drive you. Independence, it was both terrifying and exhilarating to contemplate. In Boston, she'd been constrained by both convention and circumstance. Here, necessity would grant her freedoms she'd never known. Charles, she said after a moment, I should tell you that I'm not very practical. I can cook simple meals and keep house, but I've never preserved food or made soap or, she gestured helplessly. Any of the 100 things a ranch wife must know. I don't expect you to know everything at once, he replied. Martha didn't either when we first came. We learned together. He glanced at her. Mrs. Henderson at the next ranch over is a good soul. She'd help you, I'm sure. How far is the next ranch? About 5 miles that way, he pointed west. The Madisons are about 7 miles east, not close by city standards, but neighbors out here. The evening cooled rapidly as darkness fell, and Clara found herself shivering despite the shawl she wore. We should head in, Charles said, noticing her discomfort. Days start early here. I'll be up before dawn to see to the livestock. Clara nodded, suddenly exhausted as the events of the day caught up with her. Charles lit a lamp in the main room, its golden glow casting warm shadows across the log walls. There's extra blankets in the chest if you get cold, he told her, walking her to her room. And Clara, he paused, standing a respectful distance from her doorway. I'm glad you're here. His simple honesty warmed her more than any fire could have. Thank you for the welcome, she replied, and for the flowers. They were a kindness I didn't expect. Something flickered in his eyes, a question, perhaps, or a memory. Sleep well, he said softly, and turned toward his own room. Alone at last, Clara changed into her nightdress and slipped beneath the quilt. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, the mattress stuffed with something that smelled faintly of herbs. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as she stared at the unfamiliar ceiling, listening to the sounds of this strange new home. Tomorrow she would begin learning what it meant to live in this wild place, to see if she could truly belong here. The thought both terrified and thrilled her. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the small window and the distant sound of Charles moving about the cabin. Clara dressed quickly in her second-best dress, a moss-green cotton that had faded at the shoulders. She braided her hair and pinned it up, determined to present herself as capable and ready to learn. When she emerged, she found Charles by the stove, cooking eggs and bacon in a cast iron pan. He'd already been outside, his boots were dusty, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up to reveal tanned, muscular forearms. "Good morning," she greeted, suddenly shy in the bright light of day. He turned, a smile warming his face. "You slept well, I hope." "Better than I expected," she admitted. "What can I do to help?" "Coffee's ready if you'd like to pour it. Breakfast is almost done." They worked together comfortably, moving around each other in the small kitchen. Over breakfast, Charles outlined the day's activities. "Thought I'd show you the ranch this morning, introduce you to the horses. Then, after the midday meal, I need to ride out and check on the north pasture herd. You'd be welcome to come along, or you could rest here if you prefer." "I'd like to come," Clara said without hesitation. "I want to learn everything." His approval was evident in his smile. "We'll start with getting you comfortable on a horse then. I have a mare named Willow who's gentle enough for a beginner." After breakfast, Clara changed into her oldest dress, reasoning it would better withstand the rigors of horseback riding. Charles was waiting by the corral, where he'd already saddled 2 horses, a large chestnut gelding for himself, and a smaller gray mare that regarded Clara with curious brown eyes. "This is Willow," Charles said, stroking the mare's neck. "She's steady and patient, good qualities in a horse and in people." Clara approached cautiously, having had little experience with horses beyond seeing them pull carriages in Boston. "She's beautiful." "Hold out your hand flat, let her get your scent," Charles instructed. Clara did as he suggested, marveling as the velvety nose snuffled against her palm. "Hello, Willow," she murmured. "She likes you," Charles observed. "Now let me show you how to mount up." The lesson that followed was both challenging and exhilarating. Clara's first attempts to climb into the saddle were awkward, but Charles was a patient teacher, explaining each step clearly without making her feel incompetent. When she finally sat properly astride, hands correctly positioned on the reins, the sense of accomplishment was immense. "How does it feel?" Charles asked, mounting his own horse with practiced ease. "Strange," Clara admitted, "but good, I feel so tall." He laughed, the sound rich and unrestrained, the first true laugh she'd heard from him. "Wait until you're moving. We'll take it slow, just around the corral at first." Under his guidance, Clara learned to signal Willow to walk, to stop, to turn. The mare responded to the lightest pressure, seeming to understand her rider's inexperience. By mid-morning, Clara felt confident enough to venture beyond the corral. "Ready to see more of the ranch?" Charles asked. "Yes, please," she replied, flushed with excitement. They rode side by side, Charles pointing out landmarks and explaining his operation, where the cattle grazed in different seasons, how the creek provided water year-round, which areas offered the best protection during winter storms. Clara listened intently, trying to absorb everything. "It's a lot to take in," he acknowledged as they paused atop a rise overlooking the valley. "Took me years to understand this land." "It's magnificent," Clara said, genuinely moved by the sweeping vista before them. Rolling hills stretched to the horizon, the grass rippling like waves in the breeze. In the distance, snow-capped mountains rose against the sky. "I've never seen anything so vast." "That's the thing about the West," Charles mused. "Makes a person feel small and significant all at once." "Small against all this," he gestured to the landscape, "but significant because you've got to make your own way through it." They continued their tour, riding down to the creek where wildflowers like those in her welcome bouquet grew in abundance. Charles dismounted and helped Clara down, his hands strong and sure at her waist. Her legs wobbled slightly after the unaccustomed activity. "Might be sore tomorrow," he warned with a smile. "First time riding does that." "Worth it," Clara replied, rubbing her lower back discreetly. They walked alongside the creek, Patch racing ahead to splash in the water. Charles pointed out different plants, explaining which were useful for medicine or food. His knowledge impressed Clara. This was a man deeply connected to his environment. "You know so much about everything here," she observed. Charles shrugged. "Had to learn. Out here, knowing your land can mean the difference between thriving and just surviving." He glanced at her. "The Shoshone who lived here first understood that better than anyone. Old Jake, he's a half Shoshone man who helped me when I first arrived, taught me to read this place like a book." Clara bent to examine a purple flower growing near the water's edge. "What's this one?" "That's shooting star," Charles replied, crouching beside her. Blooms in spring along the creek beds. Martha used to pick them by the handful. His voice softened when he spoke of his late wife, and Clara felt a pang of something not quite jealousy, but awareness that she was stepping into a space once occupied by someone else. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman, Clara said gently. Charles nodded, his gaze distant. She was strong, determined, never complained even when things were hard. He looked directly at Clara. But you should know I'm not looking for you to be her. That wouldn't be fair to either of you. The sincerity in his words touched her deeply. Thank you for saying that. They returned to the horses, continuing their exploration of the property. By the time they returned to the cabin for the midday meal, Clara felt she had a better understanding of both the ranch and the man who had built it. Over a simple lunch of cold ham, bread, and preserves, they discussed the afternoon's plans. The ride to the north pasture is about an hour each way, Charles explained. If that's too much after your first morning on horseback, there's no shame in staying here. Clara considered her aching muscles but shook her head. I want to see everything. I'll manage. His smile was approving. We'll take it slow, and Clara, he hesitated. You might want to change into trousers for the longer ride. Her surprise must have shown on her face, for he quickly added, I mean no disrespect. Martha found riding astride in skirts impossible for any distance. I kept some of her things. He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. That's very practical, Clara said after a moment. I would appreciate it. The trousers and flannel shirt Charles provided were slightly large but serviceable when belted at the waist. Clara felt strange in the masculine attire, but had to admit it made mounting and sitting astride far more comfortable. When she emerged from her room, she half expected Charles to look shocked at her appearance. Instead, his expression held only approval. Much better for riding, he commented matter-of-factly. Ready. The afternoon ride took them through more rugged terrain, climbing into the foothills where the north pasture spread across a high plateau. As they rode, Charles explained his plans for expanding the herd, for adding more grazing land to the east, for breeding stronger stock better suited to the harsh Wyoming winters. You have a vision for this place, Clara observed. Have to, he replied. Man needs something to work toward. They located the cattle grazing contentedly, Charles counting them with practiced efficiency. All present, he announced with satisfaction. No sign of predators or strays. On the return journey, they took a different route, passing through a stand of aspen trees where golden light filtered through the leaves, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. The beauty of it caught Clara's breath. This is my favorite spot on the property, Charles confessed. Come fall, these leaves turn bright yellow, like riding through sunshine. Clara tried to imagine it, the vibrant autumn colors, the crisp air, the changing seasons in this wild place. For the first time, she allowed herself to think beyond the immediate future, to consider what it might mean to build a life here. They arrived back at the ranch as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the yard. Clara's body ached from the unaccustomed activity, but the discomfort was accompanied by a sense of accomplishment. She had ridden for hours across wild country, seen vistas few from her former world would ever witness. You did well today, Charles told her as he helped her dismount. Not everyone takes to riding so naturally. I had an excellent teacher, she replied, holding onto his shoulder longer than strictly necessary as her legs threatened to buckle. His hands remained at her waist, steadying her. For a heartbeat, they stood closer than they had before, the warmth of his body palpable in the cooling evening air. Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a question. Then Patch barked, racing across the yard toward an approaching rider, and the moment dissolved. Charles stepped back, turning toward their visitor. That's Jake Henderson, he explained, probably bringing news from town. The old man who rode up was weather-beaten and lean, with gray-streaked hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He tipped his hat to Clara with old-fashioned courtesy. So the bride's arrived, he observed with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Mrs. Henderson sent me over with some things she thought might help you settle in. He indicated a burlap sack tied to his saddle. Preserves, seeds for a kitchen garden, some patterns for quilting, and such. That's very kind, Clara said, touched by the neighborly gesture. Folks look after each other out here, Jake replied simply. Too much space between us to do otherwise. Charles invited the old man in for coffee, and they spent an hour listening to Jake's stories of the early days in the territory. His tales of survival against harsh winters, conflicts with native tribes and outlaws, and the slow building of community painted a vivid picture of frontier life. When Jake departed with promises of a proper visit from his wife soon, Clara helped Charles prepare a simple supper. They worked together comfortably, establishing an easy rhythm in the small kitchen. Jake liked you, Charles commented as they ate. He doesn't warm to everyone. I enjoyed his stories, Clara replied. He's seen so much change in his lifetime. That he has. Been in the territory since before it was a territory, saw the first transcontinental railroad come through, lived through peace and war with the Shoshone and Arapaho. They finished the meal and washed the dishes together, then settled in the sitting area near the fireplace. Charles built a small fire to ward off the evening chill, the dancing flames casting a warm glow across the room. Clara found herself studying his profile as he stoked the fire, the strong line of his jaw beneath his beard, the thoughtful set of his brow, the way his hands moved with confident precision. May I ask you something, Charles? She ventured. He looked up, firelight reflecting in his green eyes. Of course. Why did your advertisement specify a teacher? You have no children. A slight flush colored his cheekbones. The settlement's growing, more families coming in. The town council's been talking about establishing a proper school, but we've had no teacher. Thought if I found a wife with those skills, it might benefit more than just me. He hesitated. Was that presumptuous? No, Clara said softly. It shows forethought, consideration for the community. Would you want that? To teach again, I mean. The question stirred something in her, a sense of purpose she'd feared lost. Yes, I think I would. I loved teaching in Boston. Charles nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. I could help you build a school. There's good land near town that would work. The casual offer to build her a school, to support her profession, moved Clara deeply. This was not a man who saw a wife merely as a possession or servant, but as a partner with her own calling. Thank you, she said simply. They sat in comfortable silence as the fire burned low. Finally, Clara rose, suddenly aware of how tired she was after the day's activities. I should retire, she said. It's been a full day. Charles stood as well, maintaining a respectful distance. Sleep well, Clara. In her room, changing back into her nightdress, Clara reflected on how quickly her perceptions had shifted. Just 24 hours ago, she'd been trembling with fear at the prospect of meeting her future husband. Now, she was beginning to see possibilities in this new life that had never existed for her in Boston. The days that followed established a rhythm: mornings learning ranch tasks, afternoons exploring different parts of the property. Charles proved a patient teacher, showing her how to collect eggs from the chickens, how to milk the cow he kept for household use, how to identify useful plants for cooking and medicine. Clara absorbed everything eagerly, determined to prove herself capable. When she struggled as she did with milking, her city-soft hands cramping with the unfamiliar motion, Charles offered encouragement rather than criticism. Took me weeks to get the hang of it, he admitted. Martha used to laugh at my attempts. A week after her arrival, Mrs. Henderson visited, as promised, a robust woman with silver-streaked black hair and capable hands. She brought more practical gifts, including fabric for new dresses and offers of help with any household skills Clara wished to learn. The first year's the hardest, she told Clara as they sat on the porch shelling peas. Everything's new and there's so much to learn it can overwhelm you, but you strike me as a determined sort. I'm trying to be, Clara replied honestly. Mrs. Henderson's sharp eyes missed nothing. Charles is a good man, steadier than most. He took Martha's passing hard, closed himself off for a long while. It's good to see him coming back to life. Clara felt her cheeks warm. We're still getting acquainted. The older woman nodded sagely, as it should be. Marriage is a serious business, especially out here where you depend on each other for survival. She patted Clara's hand. But I see how he looks at you when you're not watching, like a man who's found water after a long drought. The observation stayed with Clara, coloring her awareness of Charles in the days that followed. She began to notice the small considerations. He showed her fresh wildflowers appearing on the table, a wooden stool built to help her reach high shelves, books from his collection left casually where she might find them. For his part, Charles seemed to grow more comfortable in her presence. His natural reserve gradually yielded to reveal a man of thoughtful intelligence, dry humor, and unexpected gentleness. He spoke of his hopes for the ranch, of books he'd read during long winter evenings, of his dreams for the community's future. 2 weeks after her arrival, Charles announced they would ride into Whispering Pines the following day. Town council's meeting about the school, he explained. Thought you might want to attend, share your thoughts. Clara felt a surge of excitement at the prospect. Yes, I'd love to. The town seemed larger than she remembered from her arrival, though still modest by Eastern standards. Charles introduced her to shopkeepers and residents as they made their way to the meeting, held in the back room of the general store. Clara noticed how people deferred to him, seeking his opinion and greeting him with genuine respect. The council, 5 men including the town's mayor, doctor, and largest business owners welcomed Clara warmly when Charles explained her teaching background. Providence, declared Mayor Wilson, a portly man with impressive whiskers. The very skills we need arriving on our doorstep. Clara outlined her experience teaching in Boston and her thoughts on establishing a proper school in Whispering Pines. The men listened attentively, nodding at her practical suggestions about curriculum and necessary supplies. We've set aside land for a schoolhouse, the mayor explained, but construction has been delayed for lack of a teacher. No sense building if we had no one to teach. My wife and I would be happy to donate lumber from our property, Charles offered, and I'll help with the building. Clara glanced at him, startled by his casual reference to her as his wife. Charles caught her look and colored slightly, but the others didn't seem to notice the slip. After the meeting, which ended with enthusiastic plans for a school to open by autumn, Charles took Clara to the general store. I thought you might want to select some things, he said. Fabric for dresses more suited to ranch work, perhaps, or books if there are any that interest you. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her deeply. Together they selected sturdy cotton fabric in practical colors, thread, buttons, and other necessities. When Clara lingered over a shelf of books, Charles encouraged her to choose several. Consider it an investment in the ranch's library, he said with a smile. Their ride back to the ranch was companionable, Clara sharing her excitement about the school plans, Charles offering practical suggestions about construction details. As they crested the final hill overlooking the property, Clara found herself seeing it with new eyes, not as a strange place she had been sent to, but as a home she was helping to build. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching twilight settle over the valley, Clara found the courage to ask a question that had been forming in her mind. Charles, are you satisfied with our arrangement thus far? He turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. More than satisfied. You've taken to ranch life better than I had any right to expect. You're determined, quick to learn. And as a potential wife, the directness of her question seemed to surprise him. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze steady. I find myself thinking of you in that way more each day, he admitted finally, his voice low. But I meant what I said when you arrived. The choice is yours, Clara. I won't press you. She nodded, gathering her courage. When you called me your wife today at the meeting. That was presumptuous, he said quickly. I apologize. No, Clara replied softly. It felt right. The hope that bloomed in his eyes made her heart quicken. Charles shifted in his chair, turning more fully toward her. Are you saying, I'm beginning to see a future here, Clara interrupted gently. With the ranch, with the school, with you. Charles reached across the space between them, his hand covering hers where it rested on the arm of her chair. His palm was warm, calloused from years of hard work. I never expected to feel this way again, he confessed. After Martha died, I thought that part of me was gone, but you've brought something back to life. Clara turned her hand beneath his, their fingers intertwining. I came here expecting the worst, she admitted. I'd heard such terrible stories about mail-order marriages, but you welcomed me with flowers and kindness. "You deserved no less," Charles said simply. In the fading light, his face was half in shadow, but his eyes were clear and steady on hers. Clara found herself leaning toward him slightly, drawn by something she couldn't name. Charles hesitated, then rose from his chair, still holding her hand. Clara stood as well, their bodies close in the gathering darkness. With infinite gentleness, he raised his free hand to her cheek, his fingers warm against her skin. "May I?" he whispered. Clara nodded, her heart thundering in her chest. Charles leaned forward, his lips meeting hers in a kiss so tender it brought tears to her eyes. His beard was soft against her skin, his mouth warm and gentle. When they parted, he kept her close, their foreheads touching. "I'm falling in love with you, Clara Faulkner," he murmured. "Not the idea of you or the convenience of a wife, but you, your courage, your mind, your heart." "And I with you," she whispered back, surprised by the truth of it. In just weeks, this man and this place had worked their way into her heart, offering her a life she'd never imagined possible. The wedding was held 3 weeks later in the white church in Whispering Pines, attended by neighbors from miles around. Mrs. Henderson had helped Clara sew a simple but beautiful wedding dress from cream-colored fabric they'd ordered specially from Cheyenne. Charles wore a new shirt and his best trousers, his beard trimmed neatly for the occasion. The celebration, afterward a community affair with tables laden with food contributed by every family, lasted well into the evening. As twilight fell, Charles and Clara rode home to the ranch, now truly their shared home. At the cabin door, Charles dismounted, then lifted Clara down from her horse. Before she could step toward the door, he swept her into his arms. "Welcome home, Mrs. Quinn," he said, his voice husky with emotion. Clara's arms went around his neck, her heart full to bursting. "It's good to be home," she replied, and knew she meant it completely. As Charles carried her across the threshold into their new life together, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from fear to friendship to love, from expecting cruelty to finding kindness, from rootlessness to belonging. Outside, the Wyoming twilight deepened to night, stars appearing like diamonds scattered across the vast sky. Inside, a new family began, founded on mutual respect, and growing love as enduring as the mountains that watched over their valley, as nurturing as the creek that gave life to their land. Clara had come west seeking survival. She had found, instead, a future bright with promise, and a man who had welcomed her home with wildflowers and an open heart.